the place where most of the remaining gap is. In addition, a big part of the overrun, as you will know, was from non-market sources, which don't tend to send much signal. So you can look through all that and think, okay, that then we seem to be set up for further progress. But being seemed to set up for it is one thing, having it is another. So we're going to want to see further progress on inflation. Remember, we're not, we're under 2%, but our goal is 2%, and we do mean to get back sustainably to 2%.
And in terms of the labor market, I mean, how is that broadly, you said a broad set of indicators show that it's in a pretty solid place. Was there broad agreement on that? There's been a few underlying indicators that are showing perhaps some weakness, a low hiring rate, workers reporting that it's increasingly difficult to find a job. Is that of concern to the committee? So you're right. I mean, you look at, of course, a very broad range. So it starts with unemployment, with the unemployment rate, employment, participation, wages, job. The ratio of vacancies to unemployed. We look at all those things, and you put your finger though on it's a low hiring environment. So if you have a job, it's all good, but if you have to find a job, the job finding rate, the hiring rates have come down, and that's more typical of a. Let's say that the unemployment that the labor market is at a sustainable level. It's not overheated anymore. We don't think we need it to cool off anymore. We do watch it extremely carefully. It's one of our two goal variables. But I'd say we watch those things quite carefully. But nonetheless, overall, look at the aggregate data in the labor market. The labor market does seem to be pretty stable and broadly in balance when you've got an unemployment rate that has been pretty stable now for a full half year.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Edward Lawrence with Fox Business. On employment, now you said there's a broad range of possibilities, but last September you said, quote, "We understand that there's been quite an influx across the borders, and that has actually been one of the things that's allowed unemployment rate to rise." Now that the flow of the border has slowed and we're seeing deportations, how do you expect the unemployment rate to react?
So what's happening is that the flows across the border have decreased very significantly, and there's every reason to expect that to continue. But job creation has come down a bit too. So, if those two things come down together, that sort of can be a reason for the unemployment rate to stabilize. In other words, the break-even rate, as population growth slows, the break-even rate that you need in new jobs to make jobs for workers declines as well. So that seems to be something about what's happening. You do see a very flat unemployment rate at a time when you've seen significant declines.
I want to ask you about Fed employment. I know that tax money is not used here, but Elon Musk alleges that the Fed is, quote, absurdly overstaffed. We've seen the executive branch push to reduce the federal workforce. I just want to get your reaction. We run a very careful budget process. We're fully aware that we owe that to the public, and we believe we do that. I've got no further comment than that. Thanks.
Chris Rugaber at Associated Press. President Trump has said he will lower inflation by reducing gas and energy costs. Do you see such costs as a particular driver of inflation, and would lowering them have a dramatic effect?
Chris, I'm not going to react or discuss anything that any elected politician might say. So I'll give you a mulligan.
Okay, thank you. Well, nearly 2 weeks ago, the Fed said it was withdrawing from the network for greening the financial system, even as we have significant wildfires in Los Angeles doing billions of dollars in damage. And of course, the NGFS, as you know, is a group to talk about how the financial system could address climate change. Many commentators did see the timing as political. Why did you leave that organization? Can you explain that decision? Sure,
I'd be glad to. So we considered this, really at length, and we did decide to withdraw from the NGFS. And really, the reason is that the work that the NGFS does has broadened very significantly. Think about nature-related risks and biodiversity and things like that. In addition,
the work of the NGFS is in significant part intended to, and this is a quote, mobilize mainstream finance to transition to a sustainable economy. So we joined to get the benefit of understanding what other central banks were doing and seeing research and things like that. I think this is just way beyond any plausible mandate that you could attribute to the Fed. And so we have a quite narrow role, as I've said many times, and I think that the activities of the NGFS are not a good fit for the Fed, given our current mandate and authority. So, and I just think it was time to acknowledge that, the process, this process dates back, thinking about it dates back a couple of years. I made the decision to bring this to the board, some months ago. It just the process just took time to get here, and this is when we got it and voted on it. So, and I'm aware of how it can look, but it was really not driven by politics. It was driven by kind of the disconnect between the work of the NGFS and our mandate. Other central banks have different mandates and belong to the NGFS. We have no criticism of them, but it just isn't. It's not right for the Fed.
Andrew.
Thanks, Andrew Ackerman with the Washington Post. I'm wondering if you could talk more about what further progress would look like for consumers.
Well, 2% inflation down to 2% sustainably is what we're trying to achieve. We're somewhat above that, as you know, and we want to see serial readings that suggest that we're making further progress on inflation. That's what we want to see, and consumers will pick that up, of course, in the things that they buy at the grocery store or at the store.
The other thing I wanted to ask was just how far away you think you are from neutral.
Yeah, you can't know with any precision, of course. As I like to say, that you know the neutral rate by its works. So I think at 4.3%, we're above. How much that is, but not knowing that and having cut 100 basis points means that it's appropriate that we not be in a hurry to make further adjustments.
Victoria.
Victoria Guido with Pol. As when it comes to executive orders and OMB memos, do you apply to the Fed sometimes, never, or do you just entirely?
So it's been our practice, as I mentioned, to work to align policies to those that are mentioned in the executive orders, and I'm just going to leave it at that. As I mentioned, I'm not going to go any deeper than that, or get into any deeper into this set of issues today.
Claire Jones from the Financial Times. Two questions, if I may, on tariffs. Well, first of all, we've seen global trade wars before, notably in 2019, last time around, but then we were in a very different place on both inflation and growth. If we see tariffs of the same sort of magnitude that we got then, which do you think might be different this time around? Tiff Macklem said there was that the threat of tariffs was Canada today. What sort of information would the Fed need to see on tariffs before it was willing to take such What sort of information would you need? Would you need to see a strategy, actual implementation, inflation expectations before you're actually change the path of monetary policy on the basis of it?
Yeah, so first of all, things are a little different now. We've just come through a high inflation period, and you can argue that both ways. You can say that companies have figured out that they do like to raise prices, but we also hear a lot from companies these days that consumers have really had it with price increases, and so I don't know how that shakes out. Nonetheless, you're coming through a situation where we're not quite back to 2%, and that's just different. In addition, the trade, the kind of footprint of trade has changed a lot as trade is now spread around. It's not as concentrated in China as it was. There's a lot more manufacturing. It moved to Mexico and other places. So there are differences, and I just think the range of possibilities is very, very wide. We just don't know, and I don't want to start speculating.
هل قمتم بإنهاء مناقشة سياسة التجديد النقدي؟ ثانيا، ما حصل في سوق الأسهم أو الذكاء الاصطناعي هل أعطاك أي إشارة عن الظروف التمويلية؟
No, and we didn't know, by the way, in 2000.
الاحتياطي يبقى قويا.
And I guess 18. Yeah, we didn't really know, and the range of possibilities very, very wide. We don't know what's going to be tariffed. We don't know for how long or how much. What countries? We don't know about retaliation. We don't know how it's going to transmit through the economy to consumers. That's seen. There are lots of where that price increase between the manufacturer. So many variables. So we're just going to have to wait and see. And the best we can do is what we've done, which is study up on this and look at historical, read the literature, and think about the factors that might matter. And then we'll just have to see how it goes.
Thank you. Courtney Brown from Axios. Two unrelated questions. The first is whether or not there was any discussion about QT and the timeline for ending QT at this meeting. And then the second question is just, I wonder if the AI-prompted sell-off in the stock market this week signaled anything to you about the state of financial conditions?
So, let's talk about runoff. So the most recent data do suggest that reserves are still abundant. Reserves remain roughly as high as they were when runoff began, and the federal funds rate has been very steady within the target range. We track a bunch of metrics, and they do tend to point to reserves being abundant. We do intend to reduce the size of our balance sheet to a level that's consistent with implementing monetary policy efficiently and effectively in our ample reserves regime. We're closely monitoring a range of indicators to assess conditions, and that should provide signals whether reserves are approaching a level that could be judged as, quote, somewhat above ample. I don't have anything to say to you about particular dates. It's just that's the process, and what we see is that rates do appear to be abundant. As always, we stand ready to take appropriate action to support that smooth transition of monetary policy, including to adjust the details of our approach for reducing the size of the balance sheet in light of economic and financial developments. On AI, it's a big event in the stock market and in particular parts of the stock market. I mean, what really matters for us is macro developments, and that means substantial changes in financial conditions that are persistent for a period of time. So I wouldn't put that label on these events, although, of course, we're all watching it with interest.
Simon Rabinovich with The Economist. Thank you. You mentioned in your remarks that activity in the housing sector seems to have stabilized. At the same time, since your first rate cut in September, long-term mortgage rates have gone up by a full percentage point back above 7%. I'm wondering, kind of looking forward, are you confident that activity will remain stable given how elevated mortgage rates are? How does it fit into your broader thinking about the economy?
So, as you know, as we've reduced our policy rate 100 basis points, longer rates have gone up, not because of expectations, not principally because of expectations about our policy or about inflation. It's more a term premium story. So, and it's long rates that matter for housing. So, I don't think I think these higher rates are going to they're probably hold back housing activity to some extent if they're persistent. We'll have to see how long they persist. So, we control an overnight rate. Generally, it propagates through the whole family of asset prices, including interest rates. But in this particular case, it's all happened at a time when, for reasons unrelated to our policy, longer rates have moved up.
Thank you, Chair Powell. Jennifer Schonberger with Yahoo Finance. You said you want to see further progress on inflation. Given that households appear to be unhappy with the elevated level of prices, do you believe the committee should wait until inflation has fallen back to target to cut rates again?
No, I wouldn't say that. We've never said we need to be all the way at target to reduce rates. At any time, what we're doing is we're looking at the economy and asking whether our policy stance is the right one to achieve maximum employment and price stability. So I think if we would want to see further progress, but we think our, as I mentioned, we think that our policy stance is restrictive, meaningfully restrictive, not highly restrictive, but meaningfully restrictive. And so I would think we need to see further progress. I wouldn't say all the way back down to 2% on a sustainable basis. Although we'd love to see that, of course, and we will.
And separate question for you on tariffs. Curious whether the threat of tariffs and not knowing whether they could stick or not creates uncertainty for business here in the United States and could cause them to pull back, ultimately weighing on growth. Does the threat of tariffs cause you to ponder your growth forecast?
I want to avoid commenting even indirectly on the conduct of tariffs. It's not our job, and it's not our job to comment on the moves that people make. So I wouldn't want to criticize anything that's happening or really comment on it one way or another, praise it for that matter. It's just not our job. I do think that, we found in 2018 there was a lot of work done on trade policy uncertainty. Trade policy uncertainty, if it's large and persistent, can start to matter for businesses making investment decisions and things like that. That's not something I'm observing today. It's very early days for this, but I think that did matter in 2018-19, and it's one of many things we'll be watching.
Thank you, Chair Powell. Matt Egan from CNN. Following up on Courtney's question from earlier about the stock market, how concerned are you, if at all, about potential asset bubble brewing in financial markets? How do relatively high market valuations factor into considerations about potentially lowering interest rates further? Is that something that's in the back of your mind?
So we look at, from a financial stability perspective, at asset prices generally, along with things like leverage in the household sector, leverage in the banking system, funding risk for banks and things like that. But it's just one of the four things. Asset prices are, and yeah, I'd say they're elevated by many metrics right now. A good part of that, of course, is this thing around tech and AI, but we look at that. But we look at how resilient the households and businesses and the financial sector are to those things. So we look at that mainly from a financial stability perspective, and we think that there's a lot of resilience out there. Banks have high capital, and households are actually overall, not all households, but in the aggregate, households are in pretty good shape financially these days. So that's how we think about that. We look at overall financial conditions, and you can't just take equity prices. You've got to look at rates too, and that represents a tightening in conditions with higher rates. So
overall, financial conditions are probably still somewhat accommodative, but it's a mixed bag.
Hi, Chair Powell. I'm Richard Escobedo with CBS News. One question for you. This month's statement notes that unemployment has stabilized at a low rate and that the labor market is solid. You walked through some of what's driving this, but I wonder what risks you see that might challenge your assessment.
Well, the things we discussed earlier, one is that there's a low hiring rate. And so that if there were to be a spike in layoffs, if companies were to start to reduce headcount, you would see unemployment go up pretty quickly because the hiring rate is quite low. So that's one thing we look at. I think it's worth pointing out that for lower income households, they're under significant pressure. And in the aggregate, the numbers are good, but we know that people at the lower end of the income spectrum are struggling with costs. And really, it's high inflation for the basics of life. It's not so much the inflation now, it's the price level. Because inflation has raised prices. Inflation is now much closer to target, but people are really feeling that. But, overall, this is a good labor market. You're at 4.1% unemployment. That's just a really good level, and you've been solidly there now for 6-7 months. And job creation is pretty close to a level that will hold the unemployment rate there, given that there'll be much lower population growth.
One more question. Some of the uncertainty around immigration policy, in your assessment, is that making it harder for businesses and the Fed to plan going forward?
We hear anecdotal reports, but I don't see. There's nothing in the data yet on that. But you hear that kind of thing about construction, for example, and businesses that are dependent on immigrant labor are saying that it's suddenly gotten harder to get people. But you don't see that in the aggregate data yet. But yes, you hear it anecdotally.
Thank you, Chair Powell. Nicholas Jasinski from Barron's. The uncertainty is certainly a theme today, and I'm wondering, are there any periods from your career or as it relates to markets, the economy, what's going on here in Washington and beyond, or from lessons from history that may provide some guidance for a central banker operating in uncertain times like today?
I guess I'd say this. Uncertainty is with us all the time. It is human nature, apparently, to underestimate how fat the tails are in a way. The possibility, we think of things in a normal distribution, and in the economy it's not a normal distribution. The tails are very fat, meaning things can happen way out of your expectations. It's never not that way. I wouldn't, if you think about it, think about the first few months of the pandemic. That was uncertainty. Are we going to be able to reopen the economy? If so, when? How much of it? How long will it take? That was uncertainty. What we have now is a good labor market. We have the economy growing at 2 to 2.5%. Inflation's come down to now the headline inflation number was 2.6, and that's what the public experiences. We look at core because it's a better indicator of future inflation. So yes, the price level went up a lot for inflation, and people are feeling that, and they're not wrong. But so the kind of uncertainty we have is just a usual level of uncertainty about the economy, but then policies which are not for us to criticize or praise, really. Those are policies which people have been elected to implement. They're implementing them with a view to making a better economy. And so I wouldn't call this out as one of those times. I wouldn't compare it to the global financial crisis or anything like that, given that we have actually a very good economy right now.
Reviewing 5 years. في مراجعتكم لآخر 5 سنوات.
Evan Reiser with Market News International. Chair Powell, is a March cut still on the table? And then additionally, are you looking to see better than expected data on inflation to cut? Or are you looking for inflation data that roughly aligns with current forecasts?
So, as I mentioned, the economy is strong, the labor market is solid, downside risks to the labor market appear to have abated, and we think disinflation continues on a slow and sometimes bumpy path. That tells me, and the other members of the committee, the broad sense of the committee actually is that we don't need to be in a hurry to adjust our policy stance. Your second question was?
whether or not you need to see better than expected inflation data or just inflation data that roughly aligns with your current forecasts?
You know, it's one of those things we'll know it when we see it, but more the expectation is that we will make continued progress. And, you know, that's what we want. We'll know it when we see it. It's going to have to be something that isn't just idiosyncratic. You're going to want to see, you know, continued progress with housing services inflation. You're going to want to see inflation behaving in a way that builds confidence that we are really making progress. That's what it's going to be. And I mean, is that better than our expectations? We expect to see that. It's just a question of when.
Chair Powell, Scott Horsley from NPR. In your 5-year review, you said the 2% inflation target won't be on the table. Can you talk a little bit about why? Is that because you think that's the right target, or is it because you don't want to move the goalpost mid-game, or what's behind that?
I think that goal has served us well over a long period of time. It's also the sort of global standard. I think that if central bank wanted to look at changing that, you wouldn't do it at a time when you're not meeting it anyway. I would not look at changing it anyway, but I certainly wouldn't look at it at a time when you're not meeting it. I mean, there's just no interest at all in changing it. If I'm being at all unclear, we're not going to change the inflation goal anytime soon.
And 5 years ago, if I can paraphrase what y'all decided, it was you're going to not raise interest rates preemptively to head off inflation until you see sort of the whites of the eyes of inflation, because the solid labor market was so beneficial. Have the last few years changed your thinking about that?
So what we really said was that we wouldn't look at a strong labor market and raise rates unless we saw some evidence of inflation. So the thought was that we'd seen really low levels of of unemployment with no sign of inflation. So why would you preemptively want to put people out of work in the absence of any kind of any evidence that suggested that this was not a sustainable level? It was a way of acknowledging how much humility we have about the starred variables, especially U-star, the natural rate of unemployment. So that was an insight. We'll discuss that again. That'll be one of the many things that we discuss. But I don't think that insight is wrong. We didn't, you know, we said what we said was that, you know, at times when inflation persistently undershot 2%. We would likely allow inflation to run moderately above 2% for some time. That's what we said. That turned out not to be relevant to what actually happened. There was nothing moderate about the overshoot. It was an exogenous event. It was the pandemic, and it happened. And you know, our framework permitted us to act quite vigorously, and we did once we decided that that's what we should do. The framework had really nothing to do with the decision. We looked at the inflation as transitory, and right up to the point where the data turned against that. And when the data turned against that in late 21, we changed our view and we raised rates a lot. And here we are at 4.1% unemployment and inflation way down. But the framework was more irrelevant than anything else. That part of it was irrelevant. The rest of the framework worked just fine as we used it, as it supported what we did to bring inflation down.
Hello, Chairman Powell. Mark Hamrick with Bankrate. As you know, in the annual report from the Financial Stability Oversight Council, among the risks outlined is cryptocurrency. Could you talk about those risks now? And regarding individuals and households, perhaps distinct from the concern about the financial system, do you worry that speculation in this unregulated asset class could hurt their financial well-being, or do you think it has a place in a household's portfolio?
You know, so our role with Bitcoin really is to look at, with crypto, really is to look at the banks, and you know, we think it's, you know, banks are perfectly able to serve crypto customers as long as they understand and can manage the risks, and it's safe and sound.
إذن إخواني المشاهدين الأعزاء انتهينا من نقل لحضراتكم البث المباشر مترجما للمؤتمر الصحفي للسيد جيروم باول بعد قراره بتثبيت الفائدة لأول مرة في عام 2025. إذن أخواني المشاهدين الأعزاء، الآن انتهى المؤتمر الصحفي للسيد جيروم باول، وأجاب عن كل أسئلة الصحفيين بحنكة، حيث قرر الفيدرالي الأمريكي إبقاء سعر الفائدة عند 4.5% دون أي تغيير في قراره الأول في عام 2025 وقراره الأول تحت رئاسة دونالد ترامب في ولايته الثانية، حيث دعا الرئيس الأمريكي دونالد ترامب في وقت سابق الفيدرالي الأمريكي إلى ضرورة خفض أسعار الفائدة. وينتظر السوق حاليا مطالعة تفاصيل ودراسة كلمات جيروم باول للمؤتمر الصحفي لقراءة الميول المستقبلية للفيدرالي وسط تحسن واضح في اتجاه التضخم نحو المستهدف. تفاصيل بيان الفيدرالي كاملة بعد قراره الإبقاء على سعر الفائدة الرئيسي دون تغيير، في خطوة تعكس تراجعا عن الاتجاه الأخير لتخفيف السياسة النقدية. جاء هذا القرار أخوان الأعزاء وسط تطلع الفيدرالي إلى مشهد اقتصادي وسياسي محفوف بالتحديات، في خطوة كانت متوقعة على نطاق واسع، وأبقت لجنة السوق المفتوحة التابعة للبنك الفيدرالي على سعر الفائدة في نطاق يتراوح بين 4.25% و4.5%. هذا القرار أخوان المشاهدين يأتي بعد 3 تخفيضات متتالية منذ سبتمبر 2024، حيث بلغ مجموع هذه التخفيضات بحساب النقطة المئوية وصلت إلى 100 نقطة أساس، وهو يمثل أول اجتماع للبنك الفيدرالي منذ أن تولى الرئيس الأسبق دونالد ترامب المعروف بانتقاده المتكرر للاحتياطي الفيدرالي منصبه الأسبوع الماضي. وقد أعلن ترامب على الفور عن نيته أن يرى البنك الفيدرالي يخفض أسعار الفائدة. لم يقدم البيان حقيقة أخوان المشاهدين الأعزاء الصادر بعد الاجتماع سوى تلميحات محدودة جدا حول أسباب قرار الإبقاء على أسعار الفائدة دون تغيير، وأظهر البيان نظرة أكثر تفاؤلا إن صح التعبير بشأن سوق العمل، بينما أسقط إشارة رئيسية من بيان ديسمبر الماضي التي أشارت إلى أن التضخم أحرز تقدما واضحا نحو هدف الفيدرالي البالغ 2%. أيضا جاء في البيان الجديد أن معدل البطالة استقر عند مستوى منخفض في الأشهر الأخيرة، وظلت ظروف سوق العمل قوية جدا، لكن التضخم لا يزال مرتفعا بعض الشيء. ونضع عند كلمة بعض الشيء قوسين إذا سمحتم. لا يزال التضخم مرتفعا بعض الشيء. سوق عمل أقوى وتضخم أقوى مستمر يوفران حافزا أقل للفيدرالي لتخفيف السياسة النقدية، كما أشار البيان في مرة ثانية إلى أن الاقتصاد واصل التوسع بوتيرة قوية. وأظهرت التصريحات الأخيرة لصانعي السياسة النقدية بعض القلق بشأن ما إذا كان التقدم في خفض التضخم قد توقف تماما. كما أكد المسؤولون في الفيدرالي أنهم يرغبون في رؤية كيف تؤثر التخفيضات السابقة على الاقتصاد، على الرغم من توقع معظمهم تخفيضات في أسعار الفائدة هذا العام. انتبهوا. وأيضا جاء في القرار على خلفية مشهد سياسي متقلب. أيضا في غضون أكثر من أسبوع بقليل غير ترامب ملامح السياسة في واشنطن، وبدأ يوقع على قرارات كثيرة، حيث وقع مئات الأوامر التنفيذية التي تهدف إلى تنفيذ أجندة سياسية عدوانية. ودعم الرئيس أيضا دونالد ترامب الرسوم الجمركية كأداة اقتصادية وسياسية خارجية أيضا، وأمر بموجبه ترحيلات ضد من يعبرون الحدود بشكل غير قانوني، وطرح أسئلة من الإجراءات لإلغاء القيود التنظيمية. علاوة على ذلك أخواني مشاهدين قناة فوركس فيديو، تحدث ترامب إذا تذكرون الأسبوع الماضي عن ثقته في قدرته على خفض التضخم، وقال إنه سيطلب تخفيض أسعار الفائدة immediately فورا. وعلى الرغم من أن الرئيس الأمريكي لا يملك سلطة على الاحتياطي الفيدرالي، هذا الذي نعرفه، لكن ما وراء الكواليس لا نعرف. إذن الرئيس الأمريكي دونالد ترامب لا يملك سلطة على الفيدرالي إلا في تعيين أعضاء مجلس الإدارة، فهو باستطاعته تعيين من لهم الولاء لترامب، أليس كذلك؟ فإن من تصريحه أشار إلى علاقة محتملة التوتر مع صانعي السياسة النقدية، علاقة يعني تحتمل إلى حد كبير التوتر، أيضا تشبه تلك التي كانت موجودة خلال ولايته الأولى، انخفض التضخم بشكل حاد عن ذروته التي بلغها في منتصف 2022، لكن هدف الفيدرالي 2% لا زال بعيد المنال حسب ما جاء في بيان الفيدرالي هذه الليلة. في الواقع أظهر المقياس المفضل للفيدرالي لقياس الأسعار ارتفاع التضخم الشامل 2.4% في نوفمبر، وهو الأعلى منذ يوليو، بينما بقي التضخم الأساسي باستثناء الغذاء والطاقة عند 2.8%. كان السوق أو المتداولون أيضا يضعون في اعتبارهم احتمالات تقترب من 100% 100% بأن الفيدرالي سيحافظ على أسعار الفائدة في هذا الاجتماع، ولا يتوقعون تخفيضا آخر حتى يونيو المقبل. طبعا تشير التوقعات واسعة النطاق في العالم إلى أن معدل الفائدة سيصل إلى 3.9% بنهاية عام 2025، مما يعني احتمالا بنسبة 61% لتخفيضين بمقدار ربع نقطة مئوية هذا العام، وفقا لبيانات مجموعة استطلاعات الرأي CME. بإمكانك زيارتها، موقع إلكتروني أختي أخي المشاهد. كان النمو الاقتصادي قويا، واستمر إنفاق المستهلكين في الأداء الجيد خلال عام 2024، ويقدر الاحتياطي الفيدرالي في أتلانتا أن الناتج المحلي الإجمالي ينمو بوتيرة سنوية تبلغ 2.3% في الربع الرابع، بعد أن خفض التقرير يوم الأربعاء من 3.2% بسبب ضعف بيانات الاستثمار المحلي الخاص. شهد اجتماع الفيدرالي اخوان المشاهدين الاعزاء تغييرا في تشكيله التصويت داخل لجنه السوق المفتوح. انضم الى الرئيس جيروم باول واعضاء مجلس المحافظين الاخرين السبعه كاعضاء مصوتين هذا العام الرؤساء الاقليميون اوستن غولسبي من شيكاغو، والبرتو موسالم من سانت لويس، وسوزان كولينز من بوسطن، وجيفري شميد من كانساس سيتي. وكان التصويت على الابقاء على معدل الفائده دون تغيير اجماعا، قرار اجماع. كانت هذه اخوان المشاهدين اهم ما ورد لدينا من اخبار حول اخبار البنك الاحتياطي الفيدرالي بعد تثبيت الفائده. اذا الملخص: البنك الاحتياطي الفيدرالي قام بتثبيت الفائده تثبيت الفائده هذه الليله على الدولار الامريكي، وكان مجلس محافظي البنك الاحتياطي الفيدرالي صوتوا اجماعا على تثبيت الفائده، لكن التوقعات لا زالت تشير الى تخفيضات محتمله هذا العام. نقلنا لحضراتكم المؤتمر الصحفي للسيد جيروم باول مترجما، وكان يرد على الصحفيين يسألونه وهو يرد، والأسواق تتفاعل. ماذا حدث في الأسواق؟ دعونا نشاهد الآن الذهب. الذهب اخوان المشاهدين الاعزاء